Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into compromise, crisis, and secession, unpacking the incredibly volatile decade right before the American Civil War. We're going to look at the massive shifts that took place between 1850 and the early 1860s. Now, we aren't just going to sit here and memorize dates. Instead, we're mapping out a historical chain reaction, strictly following the evidence, to see exactly how and why the United States fractured.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We'll start with causes versus triggers, move on to the Compromise of 1850, look at rising sectional strife, explore the election of 1860, and finally end up at crisis and secession. All right, part 1, causes versus triggers, and understanding how historical events unfold. So to really build our historical thinking skills, we have to recognize that absolutely no event happens in a vacuum. History isn't just a random sequence of stuff happening, right? The crucial point here is distinguishing between deep underlying causes and immediate triggers. Think of an underlying cause like a room slowly filling with flammable gas. It's a long-term, simmering condition, kind of like the deep-rooted national division over slavery. An immediate trigger, on the other hand, well, that's the spark. It's the explosive event, say a highly contested election, that finally sets the whole room ablaze. As we go through this, keep asking yourself, is this a slow-building cause, or is it the spark?
Moving on to Section 2, the Compromise of 1850, which was a very fragile peace. Let's head back to 1850 and see what happens. Lawmakers honestly thought they were fixing the country's problems, but early attempts to settle these national disputes actually exposed massive sectional fault lines. In fact, the Compromise of 1850 completely failed to heal the nation's divides. How do we know? Well, matching our historical claim with direct evidence from our sources, we see that Congress had to endure months of, quote, rancorous debate just to pass these 5 laws. It definitely wasn't a happy agreement. It was a hostile process that basically just put a Band-Aid on the deep fractures of the country.
Without a doubt, the most controversial part of the whole compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act. This law didn't just target freedom seekers, it actually made it a federal crime to refuse to help capture them. So inaction became a literal crime. You can imagine the intense reaction to this. Both black and white Americans defied the law by heavily participating in the Underground Railroad to provide safe houses. On top of that, 8 northern states actively pushed back, passing their own personal liberty laws to completely counteract the federal mandate.
Okay, let's pause for a quick check on our understanding of this cause and effect relationship. Based on the evidence we just reviewed, why did this so-called compromise fail to actually bring peace to the North and the South? So here's the immediate reasoning. The Fugitive Slave Act actively inflamed the underlying moral debate, resulting in direct defiance rather than peace. By forcing Northern citizens to be complicit in a system they fundamentally opposed, the law totally erased any middle ground. It fueled the expansion of the Underground Railroad and pushed state governments to openly defy the federal government. So, yeah, instead of a compromise, it acted more like an accelerant. Section 3, Rising Sectional Strife, looking at the decade of division. As we move through the 1850s, we see these underlying tensions rapidly accelerating. It's a multi-year chain reaction. We go from the Compromise of 1850 straight into the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which reignited fierce debates about where slavery would be permitted in the West. Then the 1857 Dred Scott decision threw even more fuel on the fire, leading right up to John Brown's raid in 1859. Every single one of these events perfectly set the stage for the next, raising the stakes higher and higher. Let's look at another claim backed by evidence. Supreme Court rulings actually intensified national division. The Dred Scott decision acted as a massive underlying cause because, as our evidence shows, it greatly worsened sectional strife over the dilemma of free or slave soil in the West. It essentially proved to the country that the legal system could not peacefully resolve this core national dispute. Time for our second pause check to test our analytical framework. Think back to our flammable gas versus the spark analogy. Were these massive events of the 1850s, like the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision, underlying causes, or were they immediate triggers? The immediate reasoning here is that these court decisions and legislative acts were absolutely underlying causes. They were slowly raising the temperature of the nation's sectional identity. While they were incredibly important and highly divisive, they didn't just instantly start a war on their own. Instead, they were pumping massive amounts of tension into that long-term simmering condition we talked about, perfectly setting the stage for a future spark.
Which brings us to Section 4, the election of 1860, a true watershed event.
We've just spent a whole decade building up the underlying causes, and now we arrive at the moment that changes absolutely everything. While the election itself didn't solely cause the war, it served as the ultimate flashpoint for decades of built-up pressure. The source text is very clear on this. Abraham Lincoln's election was the culmination of all those increasing tensions between the pro-slavery South and the anti-slavery North. All those rancorous debates, the failed compromises, and the court rulings, they led directly to the extreme polarization of this one single election. Now, we can cleanly separate the deep underlying cause from the immediate trigger. The deep long-term condition, the underlying cause, was the deeply rooted defense of racial slavery and white supremacy in the South. The immediate spark, the trigger that actually ignited the conflict, was the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And that takes us to Section 5, Crisis and Secession, where the time for compromise officially ends. Following this triggering event, the situation spiraled out of control so fast. 7. Just let that number sink in for a second. 7 is the number of Deep South states that seceded from the Union before President Lincoln had even taken the oath of office. The trigger of the election was so incredibly powerful that 7 states decided to leave the country, form the Confederate States of America, and fracture the nation before the newly elected president had even worked a single day in the White House. Even as the nation was literally falling apart, politicians tried to patch it up one last time. Senator Crittenden put forth a proposal, and the Corwin Amendment was floated, but these efforts went absolutely nowhere. All last-minute efforts to reach a compromise failed, proving for sure that the era of political bargaining had ended. The fault lines were just too deep. Ultimately, this failed diplomacy led straight to the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. Tracing this final chronological sequence shows us exactly how the trigger of the election led directly to the outbreak of the Civil War. In November 1860, the trigger happens with Lincoln's election. Over the winter, the immediate effect takes place as those 7 states secede, and then, by April 1861, the violence begins at Fort Sumter. It's a rapid, unbroken chain of cause and effect spanning just a few short months, but driven by decades of underlying causes. Okay, let's recap what we've covered in this explainer. We can clearly see how a decade of deep underlying sectional causes was finally ignited by the triggering election of 1860. We've learned that historical events aren't just random. They require both the slow buildup of underlying causes, like the Compromise of 1850 and the Dred Scott decision, and an immediate trigger, which was the pivotal election of 1860. This powerful combination is exactly what created the chain reaction, resulting in secession and the start of the Civil War. I want to leave you with this final transfer question to consider how we can apply these historical thinking skills today. When you look at the news and see major political events or conflicts unfolding, try to look past the immediate spark. Ask yourself, what are the deep underlying causes that have been building up for years? Thank you so much for joining me on this historical deep dive, and keep asking those great questions.